All right. We are glad to have on the APEC VIP hotline, cutting edge training for the serious athlete, apecgo.com, the main man from Rattle and Hum Sports, our Big 12 insider, because we really have not had a chance to congratulate him on his stellar picks in both the Cotton Bowl and the BCS championship game. Kevin Lonnquist. How you doing, Kevin?
Well, I was on a roll, wasn't I there, Bryan?
Yeah, I'm telling you. Listen, dude, hey, you could have been pulling for LSU, you know? Just saying.
I didn't even know if you wanted to talk about that anymore. I thought we rehashed that last.
Oh, listen, I'm done. It's okay. I've accepted it. I've moved on. Okay.
And that's what I have to do. Is I should have quit after I had the Kansas State-Oregon game predicted right at 6-2 with my picks, and then all of a sudden everything just went right into the dumper. But oh well, it just happened.
All right. So how shocked were you that the A&M Oklahoma game was such a blowout?
I really was. I really thought that Oklahoma was going to play better than that. In fact, I made a comment in when I was rating the Big 12 power rankings this final time that it was the worst performance of any of the Big 12 teams this year in the bowls. And the thing is that obviously they let Johnny Manziel out, break containment and make plays with his feet, which is always a dangerous thing to do. Their offense, they really set themselves up for failure by not converting into touchdowns and settling for field goals on their first two possessions of the game. And that's a game where the A&M's offense is efficient as it is. You've got to match them touchdown for touchdown. And if you're going field goal for touchdowns, you're in a lot of trouble. And then when they started so flat at the start of the second half, and then A&M ran away from it was church. And I really was surprised at how poorly OU played on both sides of the ball. Just linebackers were out of position, angles were poor. And again, Landry Jones did not have a very good game. His numbers will suggest otherwise, because I think he had the second most number of completions by any quarterback in Cotton Bowl history. But nonetheless, he just did not play well, and I think probably for some of his critics, they were probably glad to see him go. But I was really shocked at how poorly the Sooners played. They just completely flatlined in the second half.
When I read your column and your article about the Cotton Bowl and Manziel's performance, and you made the comment, I correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was your writing, that you felt like there just seemed to be something missing in this Oklahoma program right now.
Yeah, I think there is. I can't put my finger on it. I mean, look, if you've looked at them in pretty much some big stand-up games over the last couple of years, they've just not performed, especially in the non-conference variety. I mean, they played pretty solid against Notre Dame in October, but they didn't deliver when it was time, and they completely melted down in the second half of that game. Even though Kansas State was a conference game, again, when the offense needed to make some drives and score some points, they didn't do it. Of course, Landry had the big fumble against the Wildcats there, and then it goes back to the A&M game where they just didn't stand up. And they had some issues last year as well. They lost 3 games last year. This second straight year, they've lost 3 straight games, Bryan, and they've lost a few of these games at home. And I don't know if Bob Stoops' program has come as far as it can under him. I'm not willing to go there yet, although I think that it's worth talking about. But I think that there's something there where OU's edge isn't what it has been in previous years. And I think maybe their reputation is bigger than what they really are at this point. And they're going to have to really do some soul-searching in the offseason as far as how they get their toughness back, how they get their swagger back, and see how they can start to perform in a lot of these big games.
It sounds like they've got the same problem right now to deal with that Texas has.
I think so. I mean, Texas has obviously had a lot of problems in the last few years. After the championship game against Alabama, they've been pretty average, with the exception of maybe the second half against Oregon State in the Alamo Bowl. But sometimes these monster programs, signature football programs, go through these cycles. Now, if you want to say Oklahoma's in a down cycle with double-digit wins,
with a 10-3, yeah, I'll take that.
10-3. I mean, a lot of programs would take place would want to trade places with them. But I think you know what I mean. It's just something that there's just that missing element there that makes them a breed apart, where they're really, really in the conversation for championships, national championship discussion, that sort of thing. And I think that's just. Everyone goes through this cycle. Alabama will go through this in several years as well. I mean,
when Nick retires, yeah.
Yeah, USC's going through this right now with Lonnquist, and so every major program will experience, and Miami's been dealing with this for many, many years now, especially since they've been hit by the NCAA as hard as they've been.
This is just my feeling about this, coming from a guy that watches a lot of SEC football, but I do believe that the lack of overall emphasis on defense in this conference is hurting these teams. I really do. You talk about trying to reestablish their toughness, and I think that running the spread offense, first of all, you don't practice against toughness in practice. You practice against, throwing the ball every other down, or running the read option, and then when you get into a defensive game, you get up against a team like Notre Dame, or somebody like that. It becomes a shock because you're just not used to playing against it.
Yeah, I've maintained the philosophy, Brian, that if fast and physical will beat fast every time, and that's what the SEC has patented during this run of 7 consecutive BCS national championships. And really, again, going back to something we've talked about earlier in the year, is the fact that, you would have loved to have seen Oklahoma State get a shot at LSU last year for the national championship, because that was a pretty good Oklahoma State team. Defensively, though, that was a team that really thrived on creating a bunch of turnovers. And, of course, now they're going to make a change with Bill Young leaving and bringing up their linebackers coach to take over. But I do think there is something there. And I don't know if it's something where you have to practice and pass, because, Brian, as you've seen in your career, and as we've seen the trend where coaches there's not a lot of work of contact drills that are being done during the weeks of practice. The coaches are so leery of getting their players banged up before the Saturday football game, but they want to try and keep them as fresh as possible. So, it's a style of play, of course, with the spread that's being run all over this conference versus a very pro-style, physical brand of football that's being played in the SEC. And I think that that's just something that, A&M brought that to the SEC. I wonder how much that will translate over, but I still think that there's going to have to be some work done with the defenses. Texas's defense needs some work still. Oklahoma State's defense is going to have to be a lot more physical next year. Texas Tech, even though they made a lot of improvements this year, they were not doing a good job as far as creating turnovers and getting sacks is concerned. West Virginia needs a complete overhaul of their package. TCU's defense is really the one defense where you can really feel good about where they are moving forward, because they're kind of an old school defensive football program. But I don't know if they're going to have the offense next year, especially with their quarterbacking situation kind of in flux as it is right now.
Sure. Okay, I want to get your take on the BCS championship game. Again, were you expecting the blowout that we saw with Alabama against Notre Dame?
Well, based on my prediction, I told you who was going to win, and that was pretty much ended 4 seconds into the second quarter.
Right.
It was utter domination, basically from the first drive. And when you and I were talking about off air about just the way that the Tide played and the way they came out, especially on the second play from scrimmage when A.J. McCarron hits Kevin Norwood on a 29-yard pass on a play-action fake. And that really I think that really put the Irish in a difficult spot, because then it really showed them that Alabama was going to be versatile or balanced on both sides of the ball. They were great with Eddie Lacy. McCarron was very solid with his decision-making. I think he completed 6 of his first 7. And they just pretty much did anything they wanted to do, and that game was pretty much no contest. I said 4 seconds into the second quarter, it was over. You could make the argument that it was pretty much over after the first drive of the game.
It was very impressive. I will say this, and I think we exchanged email on this, but I thought Notre Dame played right into their hands because they came out throwing the football, and that's the one thing I didn't think Notre Dame could do especially well. And so they go in there, instead of going strength on strength and trying to run against Alabama and do what got them there, they got completely away from what they do, and I think they played right into to Saban's hands and made it easy for Alabama.
Well, they were coming into the game as a decided underdog, of course, and I think the thinking might have been with Brian Kelly and his staff is that we've got to do we've got to do some different things and take some chances with Everett Golson. A couple of the passes that they had on their first possession, while one looked like it was very close to being caught for a first down, and if it does, it changes the complexion of that drive. I don't know, though, the way that the Alabama offense looked on that first possession, if the coaching staff for Notre Dame just looked at each other and said, we're going to have to do something different here, even though we haven't had the ball yet, and we're going to have to be a lot different than how we approach things. And maybe they panicked, maybe they did play into Alabama's hands, but for sure they just weren't the better team, and they were going to have to do so many different things to try and take a chance to stay on the field with the Crimson Tide, and especially when they got the 3-and-out, and then they got a first down, and then they went 3-and-out again on their second possession. I think they weren't able to do anything running the football. When they tried to run the football, I think they managed about 32 yards. So even trying to go their strength versus Alabama's strength, I mean, it's very few teams this year against the Tide could hold their own in the trenches on both sides of the ball. Really, if you take a look at the way the A&M game unfolded, the Aggies just caught them flat-footed for the first half in Tuscaloosa. Then the Crimson Tide adjusted. It obviously wasn't enough. And then LSU played them pretty well toe-to-toe. Of course, those teams know each other pretty well. But nonetheless, just really hard to match up in the trenches. And that's a game, too, in that BCS championship game where you see where if you are really good on the offensive and defensive lines, you're going to win. And you're going to win a lot more than anybody else in the country, and that's what the Crimson Tide has done.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the changes being made at Oklahoma State. You mentioned Bill Young retiring. It sounded like it was kind of a forced retirement. And then the promotion of Glenn Spencer, their linebackers coach, to defensive coordinator. How much of a difference? And what do you make of the talk that Gundy said that Young was too old and wasn't going to be able to relate to recruiters as being part of the reason for making the change?
Well, if that was how that really circulated out there, of course it's in the media now, but if that's really what Mike said, it was probably not the politically correct statement to make. There's coaches, plenty of coaches in the industry that are in their 60s that can relate to kids. Nick Saban's 61. I think in some respects, I think the reason why there was the changes, remember Bill Young had the surgical procedure first part of the year where he missed a couple of ball games, and so I think that might have changed we have no idea as to how that might have impacted him for the balance of the season. Maybe his energy was not where he wanted it to be. Maybe it was noticeable by Mike Gundy. And of course, if you're going to have your energy, you need to have it both on game day, and you need to do it when you're hitting the road when you're recruiting. So maybe those things impacted that. And the other thing that really impacted Oklahoma State this year is that they just didn't get the turnovers on defense like they have normally been getting. I've never been a big fan of that high risk, high reward type of defensive philosophy where you can't live on other people's mistakes. You've got to line up and stop them consistently in order to be real. And then if you get the turnovers, then that works. And I don't know what Spencer's going to bring. I'm sure that his philosophy will be a little bit different. Obviously, he'll get a spring to start implementing his philosophy right now, but we'll just have to wait and see how that unfolds.
And also Todd Monken left to become the head coach at Southern Miss, and so now Mike Gundy's looking for an offensive coordinator, although I'm guessing that's a lot like Kevin Sumlin looking for an offensive coordinator. Mike Gundy's going to be the offensive guy most of the time calling the plays, right?
Sure, and don't forget, too, that Mike also lost Doug Meacham, his inside wide receivers coach. He became the offensive coordinator down in Houston. I think that was announced today, or it was on the verge of being announced. So he lost two pretty good coaches off his offensive staff. And Mike can't do it all, but I do agree with you that he is going to be the one that's going to create the offense. He's he's a quarterback, so he understands that position better than anyone else, and that's where the offense starts. But still, you've got to hire people who will have a different set of eyes at looking at your offense, being able to suggest something that maybe you didn't think of as you're trying to put together a game plan or put together your philosophy and things of that nature. So these are going to be very important hires for Mike as to how he moves forward and who he wants to bring in there. I'm sure there'll be some names that are familiar in his past and maybe the Oklahoma State fans that'll probably resurface here. But nonetheless, I think he has to make really good decisions here. The only thing I would be concerned about is because of the way he's being portrayed as kind of a egomaniacal kind of person who's power driven and that sort of thing. I don't think that's fair, but I can see where people are coming through with the argument. So the question that's going to come out of this is he going to be a hard guy to work for now because he's had a pretty good success over the last couple of years.
And my response to that would be, if you win in 10 games every year, then be as egomaniacal as you want to be. I mean, that's what Nick Saban is, legendary for being difficult to work with.
Absolutely. I mean, there's the legendary story, of course, you being the LSU fan, that when Nick came from Michigan State to LSU, when he sent the private plane up to Lansing to bring back all the assistant coaches who wanted to join him, the plane came back empty.
That's right. I remember it well.
And so, it's a case where but the coaches who are going to be involved in this process of being interviewed and potentially being hired are going to look at that program and say, it's a great place because it's a program that's really that Gundy's really put on the map. I mean, Pat Jones did a solid job there, but Mike Gundy's taken Oklahoma State football to a far different level than it's ever been. And so there are coaches who can look at this and say, this can springboard me to a different opportunity elsewhere. So I think whoever takes it will have to have that in the back of his mind, regardless of whatever happens behind the scenes.
What else? I mean, obviously, recruiting is the big deal right now, and so important for everybody. And the thing that we're seeing right now that's so different than in the past is that usually Texas and Oklahoma would walk in here and just kind of sweep through the state, get whoever they want, and then everybody else was left to fight over what was left. It seems like A&M has displaced those two as the hot team right now. So it looks like this is going to be a real battle for top-notch athletes this year for these schools in the Big 12.
This is the first weekend, this coming weekend, of official visits that are going to be taken by kids. Now, the official visits of 2013 are far different than what they were in the 1990s. And there's been a lot of scuffling. If you ever look at the Rivals recruiting boards or Scout or 247 about Texas or Oklahoma looking at kids that are committed to Baylor or to Tech or to Oklahoma State or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of rumors about the South Lake Carroll quarterback Kenny Hill, who's committed to the Aggies currently, and whether or not he's going to be looking at Baylor or Kansas State, and what kind of smoke there is to that. January is always a chaos month, even though a lot of these recruiting classes are built. About 80 to 95% of these classes are built between now and the summer of the year, going into, say, like January 15th through August 31st of this year is going to be actually building the 2014 class. But this is always kind of the weird month because somebody comes in late and they want to try and see if they can swoon a kid because they may have lost somebody. So this is what January has become into, not filling your classes, but seeing who might be rating somebody else. And it's very interesting to see Texas being very interested in a couple of Baylor kids right now.
Who do you think is a team to watch in this offseason as far as Big 12 teams are concerned?
Well, I had my top four, and of course this was before Oklahoma State had the changes with Young stepping down and then Joseph Randall declaring for the draft. But my top five teams, I said four a moment ago, but let me go five here, is that my number one I had Oklahoma, number two I had Oklahoma State, number three I had Texas, four Baylor, TCU was five. And with Oklahoma, obviously they're going to have some questions with their quarterbacks that they're going to have to answer here as far as trying to get that position settled. I think they've got some really good depth. And as we've discussed before, Bryan, they've got to get some of that it factor back for them being a program that really is not a paper tiger, if you will. Texas, I think, has a lot of work to do with its offensive line. It's probably the worst unit on that team right now. And when you have talented running backs like Jonathan Gray, Joseph Bergeron, and Malcolm Brown, and none of those guys rushed for 1,000 yards this year. Obviously, Brown had the ankle injury, but when none of those guys are rushing for 1,000 yards or getting close, there's something wrong there. With Baylor, the same thing there. Now, Baylor's going to make another run on its medical redshirt appeal for Nick Florence. They got denied earlier, but they're going to try and make another run at that. If they get denied again, then their quarterback position is pretty wide open. Their running game is going to be pretty good. And I think their defense, based on what we saw in November in the Holiday Bowl against UCLA, I think that unit's actually going to probably turn into a strength for them because they've got a bunch of young kids, Bryan, on the defensive line that are either redshirt freshmen or sophomores or kids that are going to be redshirted this coming year that I think are very, very talented. So I think Baylor's going to be very interesting to watch. Oklahoma State, they're obviously both Wes Lunt and J.W. Walsh should be healthy when spring practice works around. Now they've got to find another running back to take over for Randall. Josh Stewart's a great wide receiver, so it's a matter of making sure that the new coordinators, when they get settled in, making sure that they put their identity on the program. And then finally with TCU, of course, with Casey Paul's unknown return to the program, if he ever does come back, and if he doesn't, then it's going to be a real question as to what Gary Patterson does with the quarterbacking situation there. But the good news for them is that Wayman James, their running back, is progressing nicely from his knee surgery that he had in September. The wide receivers are very talented on paper. They need to step up and be a little bit tougher. Their defense should be fine, but again, for TCU, it goes back to who's going to be under center next year.
All right. It's great talking to you, Kevin. We really do appreciate it. Look forward to talking some hoops with you the next time we visit, okay?
Fair enough. Thank you, sir.
Good talking to you. Kevin Lonnquist from the Rattle and Hum Sports, the Big 12 Insider on Bryan Houston Sports Radio Live on 99.3 Talk FM. Let's